Persona 3 is a game about death. Not just the act of dying, but the weight of knowing that we will die. It's about how we live in the shadow of our own mortality. The game's central conceit revolves around the dark hour, a hidden time that exists between one day and the next. During this hour, most people transmogrify into coffins, blissfully unaware of the horrors that prowl the night. Only a select few remain conscious, forced to confront the reality of death that the rest of the world ignores. Isn't that a perfect encapsulation of the human condition? We all know intellectually that we're going to die, but most of the time, we push that knowledge aside. We transform ourselves into coffins, sealed away from the terrifying truth of our own impermanence. But some of us, whether by choice or circumstance, are forced to remain awake during the dark hour, to stare death in the face and ask, how do we live knowing what we know? There's a concept in philosophy called memento mori, remember that you must die. It's an ancient practice of reflection of mortality, intended not to induce fear or sadness, but to spur us to live more fully. Persona 3 is in many ways an extended meditation on this idea. The characters in the game don't have the luxury of ignoring death. They must reckon with it every night as they climb Tartarus, the massive tower that appears during the dark hour. And isn't Tartarus itself a powerful symbol? A seemingly endless climb towards what? Understanding? Transcendence? Or simply the next floor, the next battle, the next day? I'm reminded of the myth of Sisyphus, the Greek king condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. Albert Camus, in his essay on the myth, sees Sisyphus as the absurd hero, one who persists in the face of meaninglessness, finding purpose in the struggle itself. The characters in Persona 3 are, in a sense, Sisyphean heroes. Night after night, they climb their own impossible hill. They fight not because victory is assured, but because the fight itself gives their lives meaning. But Persona 3 doesn't just ask us to confront death, it asks us to form bonds in the face of it. The game's social link system encourages you to build relationships with your fellow students and community members. As you deepen those connections, your ability to create and summon personas grows stronger. There's a beautiful contradiction here. The more you open yourself up to others, the more powerful you become in facing death. It's as if the game is saying, our connections to others are what gives us strength to face our own mortality. This idea isn't new. Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, argued that our terror of death is what drives human behaviour, including our desire for connection and meaning. But what Persona 3 does is make us feel this truth viscerally. It puts us in the shoes of characters who must build friendships and find joy in everyday life, all while knowing that each day could be their last. There's a scene in the game that I keep coming back to. It's a simple moment. The protagonist is with a terminally ill student named Akinari. As they watch the sunset, Akinari shares a story he's written about a pink alligator who can't make any friends because he's different. It's a children's story on the surface, but it encapsulates the game's central theme, that life gains meaning through connection, even, or especially, in the face of death. But Persona 3 doesn't stop at individual mortality. It expands its exploration to encompass broader questions about societal death wishes and collective despair. The game's final enemy, Nyx, isn't really a villain in the traditional sense. It's the manifestation of humanity's wish for death, called into existence by the collective unconscious desire to end the pain of living. This concept resonates eerily with our world today. In an era of climate crisis, political upheaval and global pandemics, don't we sometimes see a kind of collective death wish? A desire to simply give up in the face of overwhelming challenges? There's a term in psychology, thanatos, named after the Greek personification of death. Freud proposed it as a death drive that exists in the opposition to eros, the life drive. He suggested that this death drive was behind our tendencies towards aggression, self-destruction, and the compulsion to repeat traumatic events. Persona 3 with its nicks and its shadows, is an exploration of Thanatos on a societal scale. It's asking us to consider what happens when an entire culture succumbs to the death drive, and more importantly, how do we resist it? And yet, despite these heavy themes, Persona 3 is ultimately a game about choosing life. The protagonist's final act is one of supreme self-sacrifice, not in despair, but in hope. By becoming the seal that holds back Nyx, they choose to believe in humanity's will to live. It's a reminder that in life, as in the game, the choice to live, to really live, not just exist, is one we must make again and again. In the face of despair, in the shadow of death, we must choose to connect, to love, to find meaning. As I reflect on Persona 3 now, years after first playing it, I'm struck by how its themes resonate with our current moment. In a world grappling with existential threats, where the future often seems uncertain, the game's central questions feel more relevant than ever. How do we find the courage to live fully, knowing that we will die? How do we build connections and find joy, even as we're confronted with our own fragility? How do we resist the collective pull towards despair and choose again and again to embrace life? I don't have easy answers, but perhaps, like the characters in Persona 3, the meaning lies in asking these questions, in facing our fears head-on, gun to our temple, and choosing to pull the trigger, not in defeat, but in defiance. Because in the end, isn't that what it means to be alive? To stare into the abyss of our own mortality, and still choose to climb, to connect, to love, to look death in the eye and say, "Memento vivere," remember to live.